Good evening. My name is Teo Yu Yen, and I'm one of the editors of AcademiaSG. The rest of the AcademiaSG team are here tonight as well. Jerrine George, Linda Lim, Ian Chong, Jolene Tan, and Corey Tan. On behalf of everyone, welcome to this virtual roundtable titled Regarding Racism. As some of you may know, one of the purposes of AcademiaSG is to bring the insights of scholars into wider circulation in public discourse. We believe that understandings of society that are generated through research can be useful to publics outside of academia. For some time now, we've wanted to organize a webinar on the issues of race, racialization, and racial inequality. When race and racism took on public prominence in recent weeks in Singapore, we saw that the time to put plan into action is now. There would certainly be broad interest in such an event. But more important than tapping on this interest, we could see that the ongoing conversations are troubled ones. There are many layers to the troubles, but one aspect of it is that as a society, we seem to lack tools and vocabularies for thinking and speaking to each other about race. And when we lack vocabularies, it is hard to see problems and imagine solutions. It is also incredibly difficult to understand experiences and perspectives different from our own. And this can generate an incredible amount of pain. There are many things scholars cannot do, but building vocabularies and frameworks, we definitely have something to contribute. Tonight, we have gathered a group of thinkers and educators who have, in a variety of disciplines and through different modes of work, been thinking deeply about questions of race for many years. We're very grateful that when we reached out to them, they readily agreed to participate in this roundtable. The roundtable is conceptualized as a conversation. Conversations by their nature are dynamic and open-ended, with movement in various directions, space for agreement, disagreement, and change of minds, and potential for definitive insights, but also for unresolved or new questions. I hope you'll listen attentively to what follows with this in mind. The spirit of this event is that conversations like these are one step to helping us collectively build vocabularies and frameworks. And the next steps will involve us as listeners to continue thinking and talking, challenging our own blind spots, and making further efforts beyond this evening to figure out how to use these vocabularies. Speaking tonight will be Mohamed Imran Mohamed Taib, Ah-Eng, Nazry Bahrawi, Anju Mary Paul, and Jerrine Tan. Their conversation will be facilitated by Kenneth Paul Tan. The session will be recorded, and because of the large number in the audience, to minimize distractions, we ask that all audience members keep your videos and audios off throughout the session. Thank you. Kenneth, over to you.
Thank you, Yoyan, and hello, everyone. In these recent months, I think you'll agree with me that many of us have been, I guess, overwhelmed with videos, commentary, debate, and reactions relating to events that were framed very loosely in terms of racism. We saw, for example, what looked like a battle of the Chinese gong and the Hindu prayer bell in the neighborly space of an HDB corridor. We watched how the mere sight of a young interracial couple, the man half Indian and half Filipino, and the woman half Chinese and half Thai, could so easily and perversely trigger a 60-year-old Chinese male lecturer to hurl accusations of racism at what were clearly a humiliated and bewildered couple. We saw a Chinese woman on the MRT address her fellow commuters in a not so coherent fashion, making snide remarks about their race. And we saw how a giant public institution whose raison d'etre is to promote racial harmony and social cohesion recoil from full engagement as it struggled to describe its decision to use the image of a wedding couple inappropriately and without permission as a case of cultural insensitivity rather than racism. Meanwhile, Singapore has been a recipient of international adulation for its management of ethnic and racial diversity, even as several of its political elite assert, sometimes with little discomfort, their belief that Singapore is not ready for a non-Chinese prime minister. And we start to wonder whether these events are in fact a horrifying signal that they might, after all, be right. So what does all of this mean? To answer this and other broader questions surrounding multiculturalism, race, racism, and the prospect for change in Singapore today, we have a terrific panel of speakers. And I would like to go around the table very quickly to get each speaker's succinct response to this first question, which is, what do all these recent events really mean? How should we be thinking of these events? And by doing that, help us to shape these vocabularies and frameworks that will help us speak to one another more productively. So first up is Ah-Eng. You've been teaching, Ah-Eng, you've been teaching at the University Scholars Program courses on multiculturalism and religious issues. And I think you've been thinking about these questions long before many of us here, and your publications are widely read till today. So what do you make of these spectacles in recent months?
I'm unmuted now, right?
Yes, you are.
Well, you've asked me to ask all of us to make a three-liner statement.
Yes.
First line is that I would characterize our society as a wondrous maze of exciting cultures and exchanges, and a dangerous minefield of problems, tensions, and conflicts. We are now wandering in a minefield. Now, some of these incidents are not new, nor is the underlying racism. What's new is that they are aired and they go viral in cyberspace, in social media, and with all the consequences, both intended and unintended. So today we're trying to make sense, not just of the incidents themselves, but ask deeper questions and seek insights into how we are going to live our lives in the maze and minefield of a multicultural Singapore.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Ah-Eng. Second on the list is Anju. What do you make of these events?
Thanks so much, Kenneth. I'll kind of follow on from what Ah-Eng said to add that the project of racial harmony, of multiculturalism is never done. It's never finished. You can never stop and kind of pat yourself on the back and say, oh, we've achieved it. It's always an ongoing project. It's a daily work in progress. And I think this conversation and hopefully many more that will happen and will hopefully are already happening will continue to further that cause. But that's the mindset that we have to have, that you can never stop working on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Imran is third. You've had a lot of practical experience managing interfaith discussions in society and so on. What do you make of these events?
I think we have not been talking openly about race for so long that you are right, Kenneth, that we lack certain vocabulary or tools of thinking in terms of approaching this. And therefore, what we are seeing right now is a kind of messiness in the discourse. Everyone coming from very different perspectives, and most of the time they're just talking across each other. It seems messy, and it can be quite depressing for those who want a quick resolution to this. But I'm a bit more optimistic in the sense that this messiness is to be expected, because this is the first time we are having such conversation over such an important issue that has been dragging on for so long that we need to have a bit of hope that it will pan out better as we grasp the situation better and we learn to pick on the language and work on the perspectives that are needed to bring us forward.
Thanks very much for that. Fourth on our list is Nazry. You teach at SUTD and you do a lot of work on Malay Indonesian textual and non-material cultures as they relate to racial issues. What is your perspective on these recent events?
I want to say that we need to think of racial discourses not in silos, but in relation to other things that are happening in society at large. So I think there are certainly intersections between our forthcoming, I hope, discussion on race and maybe class issues, maybe meritocracy. So I think it's an opportunity, like Imran and others. I think I'm rather optimistic, cautiously optimistic, that if we set the right tone and try to move forward, and I don't want to think that there is only one right way to doing this, that we can move forward and actually take this as an opportunity to actually re-envision the very idea of what makes modern Singapore. And I think that I've seen also, last thing I would say is that I've seen a lot of people leading the charge on how we can learn more about racism, or not racism, but race and race relations. But they are not necessarily people who are experts on the topic. And I think there are a lot of people who are out there who are experienced racism, racial relations in real life, who should actually be put on the forefront rather than just pure academics like us or thinkers like us. Yep.
Thank you so much. And finally, we have Jerrine, who teaches in Mount Holyoke College, and I think you've had a lot of experience with American students in particular. What is your take on these events?
Yeah, so to respond to the question about these recent events that have come to light or have been circulating, especially over social media and in videos, I think they simply expose issues that have been there all along, right, under the surface of our very fragile, in fact, multicultural, multiracial society. So claims that Singapore has no racism and in fact often facile approaches to thinking about race relations in Singapore have allowed such incidents to go unchecked, I think, for a long, long time. So this is a moment of reckoning, but to echo what a lot of the other panelists have said, it's also an optimistic moment, right? Because we get to reckon now with these really difficult issues and begin the hard work of acknowledgement and repair in order to truly flourish as a society.
Thank you very much. So if I can sort of pull these things together, it sounds to me like race, multiracialism, there's a side to it that's joyful, joyous, and there's a side to it that's dangerous, right? And I think, Jerrine, you're suggesting also that this joyful side, the celebration of harmony and so on and so forth, may make us blind to some of the problems and the dangers and the actual presence of racism that we either refuse to see or simply don't see. And yet occasions like this force us to build our discourse, right? And Anju, you say, it's a work in progress. We need to build this very conscientiously, and now's the time for doing this. Imran, you also say that we haven't had a lot of experience of doing this in public, and so we're at a starting point to do this, and it's difficult work. Nazry, for you also, it's building this discourse will involve trying to figure out how it connects to other discourses that are floating about in our society, whether it's about race or meritocracy, elitism, and so on and so forth. And the race discourse cannot be done in isolation. And I think importantly also, Nazry, you say that it's not just our academic and expert voices that must be part of this process. It really needs to include people who are often silenced by the very discourses that we come up with in order to make sense of our racial condition. So I think that's a really great start. Let's move on to the next round, which is to get each of you to pretty much elaborate on what you've just said. And you're given about 5 minutes each to do this, and we'll go according to the same sequence. So beginning with Ah-Eng, would you like to start us off?
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to look at my notes, but they won't open. So I'm just wondering what to do now. Okay. Okay, here we go. Well, first of all, Kenneth, you have asked me to use my precious 5 minutes to start off with the evolution of the race discourse in Singapore over several decades. I think that's quite impossible and it'll take away precious time. So what I'm going to say is that out of the scholarship, the field of scholarship, policies and practices, and in popular and real life worlds, there are several underlying themes, which also happens to fit my idea of multiculturalism being a maze and a minefield at various levels of individual, group, and nation. First of all, one theme is that there are structural and ideological realities about race and its interactions with other key dimensions, especially class, gender, and religion. Another theme, and arising from that, and one theme is really about tensions and conflicts arising from the structural and ideological realities. The other theme is a more celebratory one of cultural exchanges and hybridities. So bearing in mind those themes in the different fields, I want to jump straight into one theme, and that is the Chinese, Malay, Indian, other framework, which I assume most people are familiar with. So what I'm going to say is that given the racialized lenses in almost everything according to this framework, given the tendencies towards assumed homogeneity and sometimes core purity of cultures and the need to maintain these cultures, the tendency to ignore changed boundaries, sometimes even deny hybridities and new formations. The framework also denies interactions with other dimensions of social life. The challenge now is, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater? Do we throw out this CMIO framework, as some people have argued for, or should we do a more reduced and careful referencing by ethnicity, bearing in mind that some groups, some individuals actually still want their ethnic identities apart from, as part of a larger range of multiple identities, okay? I think I would also argue that the racialized lens that this framework tends to lead to should really move into a more multidimensional and multicolored lens, if you want to describe it as that. Most importantly, to recognize hybridities and new formations, such as intermarriages, and increasingly, and also recognize intersections, very important, very crucial to recognize the intersections of race, class, especially, and also other major dimensions of social life. So generally from the CMIO framework, I would say that we need to develop more complex, nuanced approaches to hybridities and intersections. Okay. So that's for CMIO. I also would like to say a few words, quite a lot of words actually, on Chinese privilege and racism. I think this is one concern that a lot of us have, both Chinese and non-Chinese and other groups, okay? So I would first like to clarify that we already have a broad understanding of privilege, which is usually class related and some of the other related statuses, meaning that those who have this privilege usually have access to economic, political, and social resources, and that tends to exclude others from this access, often with the ideology of racial and cultural superiority. Now, I know that there's now a concern among some circles about critical race theory that focuses more on race. I think that actually privilege and Chinese privilege in Singapore can be raised even without critical race theory. Okay. We have already a core of body of literature that focuses on historical and understanding of privilege and how it developed along race and class lines, supported by ideologies of supposed cultural traits of some ethnic groups. And some of these traits are valued as superior or better over others. Okay. So definitely, I would say privilege and Chinese privilege exists and needs to be understood historically and sociologically as to how they are developed, okay? Even by the regular person, not just academics. And some of the acts of exclusion, discrimination, and stereotyping arising from privilege. And these should be called out, especially in sectors and practices where exclusions on the basis of race are made, conscious or otherwise. And I would also point out that where class race exclusion is implemented, especially on those with less resources, it can effectively be doubly damaging. Okay? So I would call for members and organized groups within a Chinese majority, with a Chinese majority, to be more aware, to be sensitive, and to end the discrimination. Now, I'm not saying that there should be group guilt, but the majority group with access to power must always look out for inequalities and unfairness for the protection of economic and ethnic minorities. I'm actually also aware that there are some misgivings among some Chinese, especially the older ones, about Chinese privilege, in that they argue that the Chinese have already sacrificed a lot, especially in Chinese education. But I think we also must always remember that others have also sacrificed. Everybody has sacrificed in some ways, okay, including minorities. One last point about Chinese privilege. At the same time, I think we cannot use a racial lens to see everything. We cannot use Chinese privilege to see everything only as the main dimension, because then I think we run the risk of a racialized view and an ethnicized view. And it would actually become a very simplistic view of racism in everything. And then every Chinese would run the risk of being a racist just because you belong to the majority group. In fact, instead, I would say, let's be very careful in recognizing the intersections of ethnicity with class, especially in the writing of history and in sociological understanding. Do I still have time to do one more point?
A quick one, a very quick one.
Okay, this is another controversial one, and that is immigration and racism. Immigration is yet another good area to look at the intersections of ethnicity, class, and nationality. Very complex and prone to misunderstanding. I have done some research on this, especially the economic, as well as the cultural. If you remember Amy Cheong and the Malay wedding case, the curry incident, those were earlier cases that already surfaced in social media. I would like to say that overall, based on my research, prejudices, stereotypes, racism, classism, casteism, cultural superiority, they occur among some members of all groups, be these locals, foreigners, immigrants. But what is stressed so far tends to be the stereotypes of Singaporeans as racist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and so on and so forth. Okay. I think so far there's a failure to unpack the big categories and understand complexities and subcultures, such as the displaced Singaporeans. So I would say, you know, it's very easy to look for big and binary categories and labels, such as anti-immigrant, pro-immigrant, and to quickly apportion blame. And in fact, there's sometimes political correctness of simplistic pro-immigrant and anti-immigrant approaches. Again, I would say we need to have very sensitive and nuanced reading of social media comments and the responses of research subjects. I have quite a lot more to say, but I think my 5 minutes are up. Thank you.
Thank you. There's plenty to start with, and let's move on to Anju, please. 5 minutes to you.
Thanks so much, Kenneth. First of all, good evening to everyone. I can't see you, but I hope you're all doing well. I'm really grateful to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation ahead. For those of you who don't know much about me, I'm an international migration scholar. I teach at Yale NUS College here in Singapore, and I'm a sociologist by training. Sociologists, like me, usually define race as a social classificatory system used to group large numbers of people according to particular biological traits that they are assumed to have in common that keep them distinct from other races. And it's often presumed wrongly that all people of a particular race have similar biological traits. But often when we think racially, we also assume that people of a similar race share certain cultural traits as well. I'm Indian, so let me tell you some of the typical stereotypes I hear about what it means to be an Indian. So people will tell me that Indians are good at math, that Indians love to dance outside under coconut trees, that they love curry and spicy food, that Indians love to talk and argue. Now, only one of those four is true in my case, and I'll leave it to you all to try and figure out which one that is. These kinds of stereotypes exist for all racial groups. And it's important for us to understand why stereotypes exist and why we stereotype. Broadly speaking, there are roughly 3 psychological and sociological reasons why we stereotype. From a cognitive point of view, we stereotype because it just makes the world easier to deal with. We are, each of us, bombarded with new information about new people all the time. And it's easier to process all that information if we can just classify people quickly, rather than taking the time to get to know them as fully fleshed out, complex individuals. We also tend to think, oftentimes wrongly, that our ability to understand and predict how people will behave will be made simpler through these stereotypes. Second, we stereotype because it enhances our own social identity. And so we typically stereotype the groups that we belong to as being better than, superior than outgroups, the groups that we don't belong to. And finally, we stereotype because we have been socialized into seeing the world through stereotypes. Our parents, our social networks, our education systems, the mass media, all of these different social actors may be implicated in the socialization process. Racial stereotypes have immense power to shape how people behave towards us and also how we behave towards others. In hiring decisions, in dating decisions, when it comes to deciding where you want to live, in all of these situations, we are often guided by the racial stereotypes that we carry around in our heads, often unconsciously. Is that wrong? Most people would agree that negative stereotypes can be incredibly damaging. There's not that much controversy over that. But I would argue that even good stereotypes can be harmful. Now, some people might respond to me and say, if I say that all Indians are good at math, that's a compliment. What's wrong with that? The issue is that any kind of racial essentialization prevents you from seeing others as individuals rather than just representatives of their race. It glosses over, as Ah-Eng said, all the other aspects of our identities that makes us unique. We don't just have a race or ethnic identity. We have a gender identity, a class identity, and on and on and on. Racial essentialization also prevents us from seeing the diversity that exists within any racial category and the similarities that exist across racial categories. In the case of Singapore, as Ah-Eng mentioned, the racial classification system that is most prevalent and is most familiar to many people is the CMIO model. It's a very neat and a very simple model. Again, it helps us. We think it helps us go about our daily lives and go about society, go through society more easily. But as Singapore's society becomes increasingly complex, this model is showing some strain. Now, prior to 2011, a Singaporean child would inherit her father's race. That was how the policy worked. Whatever your father's race was, that was your race on your birth certificate. So if a child had a Chinese father and an Indian mother, she would only inherit her father's race on her birth certificate. From 2011 onwards, now all children who are born from that period onwards have the option of what is called a double-barreled race to be registered in their birth certificates. So the couple that I just mentioned earlier can now choose to register their child as Chinese Indian with a hyphen in between, or Indian Chinese, or just Chinese, or just Indian if they want. They have 4 options now. And it's an indication that the Singapore government is recognizing that Singapore society is becoming increasingly complex. Now, as a double-barreled child, you are allowed to change your race twice, once before you're 21 and once after you're 21. But that's a really interesting idea as well, right? How can you change your race if it's biological? What does that policy tell us about race as a social construct? In 2019, just under 20% of marriages, new marriages in Singapore, were cross-racial. That's a huge increase from what it used to be in the 1960s and 1970s, when it was roughly 3% of new marriages each year. And it's unlikely that this trend is going to change. So that's a lot of young Singaporeans who are being born today and in the coming years who don't fall neatly into the CMIO boxes. You also have, as Ah-Eng mentioned, increasing immigration into the country. And I'm talking about permanent immigrants, new citizens, who are further diversifying the ethnic makeup of Singapore. So there are various demographic pressures being placed on the CMI model. What do you do about that? Do you just keep putting people who don't fit into the other box? Or do you add more letters? Do you keep adding more letters into the alphabet? So it's CMIO, P, X, Z, whatever other letter you can think of. These are some of the questions that need to be asked by all of us, I think, who live in Singapore. And I think personally that it's wonderful that there is now so much more interest in having these conversations and talking about race in Singapore, talking about models and ways of thinking about and engaging with race, even though these conversations have to be handled with incredible sensitivity and a willingness to forgive past mistakes and even current wrong assumptions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Plenty to go on there. Let's move to the third speaker, and that's Imran. 5 minutes.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you.
You know, we all want better conversations over the issues of race, but one thing that I've realized is that there's certain lacking of understanding of the whole issue of race and racism. And I think that's where I want to emphasize a bit more in my presentation. You know, the irony is we argue so much about race and racism, but we all can agree on one thing at least, that racism is bad. I'm not sure if anyone will say that racism is good, but generally, no one will dispute that. But what we do not have is we do not have a common understanding of what constitutes racism. And that is precisely because we have not talked or discussed about it for very long, or sometimes we avoid discussing it. And we are often just being told that we don't like racism because of the racial riots, or we want racial harmony, and we have Racial Harmony Day every year. But we have not really defined racism or talked about it in that way. Any good discussion, as how many of you will know, that any good discussion on any topic must first set a common starting point. And that is the definition and also what we mean by certain things. For example, if we want to discuss about birds, right? We can't have one party thinking in terms of the crow, the other party thinking in terms of the sparrow. We'll be talking across each other and the arguments will fly across each other. And that's precisely what is happening in this online sphere when people talk about racism. So I think the crux of the matter in our public discussion on racism is that is the lack of understanding of what constitutes racism and what is the whole concept of race itself. We have not, for example, analyzed and discussed about the whole issue surrounding whether racism is something that is inborn, natural, or something that is learned, or are stereotypes simply factual generalization, or are they dehumanizing? Or is racism just simply a matter of individual problem, or can it be structural? These are issues that are worth exploring a bit more in our public conversation, instead of just jumping into like what we have seen over the PA incident of whether this is racist or not. It's just kind of binary. Here I find it sorely lacking, especially in our school system, that we are told to uphold racial harmony, but without a deep understanding of a few things. Number one is we don't have a comprehensive understanding of the emergence of the idea of race in human history itself. We are not taught that in schools. Secondly, is the beginning of the idea of race in Singapore's context itself, and in particular during the British colonial period. And third is how this ideology of race or racialization through various structures and policies put in place through coloniality have impacted and shaped our social relations in early Singapore. And we need to understand that the racial riots do not happen simply because of primordial instincts of being Malay, Chinese, or Indian, but rather there are structural and ideological dimensions tied to coloniality and the way our minds have been shaped and ordered to think. And this is tied to the bigger context of the global political economic system. And we do not think in terms of that. So if we were to understand this whole history and context of racism and race in human history, then we will understand why it's such a global phenomenon that is being debated and being discussed and being challenged across not just Singapore, but around the world, right? So we must not only teach about history of the idea of race, which is closely connected to racism, but we must also engage in decolonial thought or decolonizing our minds itself from thinking in ways that perpetuate racism if we understand the whole genesis of the idea. And here I want to offer a way of defining racism through unpacking certain concepts. To me personally, racism is the idea that firstly, the biological difference, for example, skin color or your bodily features, determines the categorization of the human being along the concept of race that is being constructed, right? We can think of Blumenbach, for example, the German taxonomist in the early 19th century, who identified human race along skin color, white, black, yellow, brown, and red, right? And these socially constructed races then carry certain fixed traits and characteristics, such as lazy or hardworking, smart, intelligent, or not. And that explains the state or condition of the race vis-a-vis other races. And then this explains and forms a hierarchy of the races along the line of superior and inferior based on these essentialized and fixed traits and characteristics. Through that, it informs our worldview and thinking that can manifest either in speech or behavior, ranging from discrimination all the way to the worst, which is extermination or genocide, as how we had seen Hitler did it during the Holocaust. Now, the fundamental error of racism here is to confuse the biological with the social through the constructed category of race, which then either hyper-humanize a group of people. That means a group of people is intelligent, for example, and doesn't matter about the differences of the individuals within that group, but if you belong to that group, you are hyper-humanized, you are intelligent, you are hardworking, you are superior, in other words. And it also consequently dehumanize another group of people along negative traits that are seen as lazy, not industrious, unable to be as intelligent as the other races. It hyper-humanize one group versus it dehumanize one group. That is why talking about racial equality is not to bring one above the other, but to destroy that kind of hierarchy and put all the races on the same humanity plane. Now, therefore, to me, the problem of racism cannot therefore be divorced from the whole concept of race itself. And here I really like Robert Miller's definition of racism as, and I quote, something, an act, a system, a policy, or could also be a movie, is racist to the extent that it appeals to or reinforces, either explicitly, implicitly, consciously, or unconsciously, essentialized perceptions of racial groups in a way that strengthens existing political, economic, or cultural inequalities. Now, from here, we can actually identify a very important, several important points here. Number one, harm here is a key principle, the idea of harm. Number two, that it goes beyond the individual when we talk about harm, right? So of course, we always think of someone, racism as, okay, a person is racist, but if we think in terms of harm, then that could also be structural in nature, or it can be lodged in policies, for example. And thirdly, if a policy disproportionately harms a racial group, it's damage, is the damage that matters, right? Hence, we can also say it's racist. So we focus not on the identity, but rather on the action that causes harm, whether it's individual action, or it could also be lodged in policies, it could lodge in structures and the way we organize society. And therefore, intent here is secondary, because whether harm is intentional or unintentional, it doesn't change the fact that it harms a group of people that is identified through that category, right? Now, if we understand this principle of harm, then I think we can have a better conversation over racism. In discussing racism, for example, it is important, as I've mentioned, to focus on the action versus the identity. Now, let's take this simple example of disability. Yeah? Let's think of the university as the building of the university, right? And let's imagine the university's building without a ramp or access for persons with disabilities, right? Now, we can talk about the history of those who actually designed the building and ask why they didn't think of having a ramp. We can question their motive. Are they against people with disability or what? But will that solve the issue? It will not solve the issue, right? Even if we belabor on the point of the architects of these buildings. Secondly, we can also try to shame and guilt trip those who carried on thinking and going to the university, either the students, the lecturers, without thinking about those with disabilities, those on wheelchairs who cannot go up the stairs, for example. They carry on life because they are privileged and it doesn't enter into their consciousness. What do? Do we shame and guilt trip them and say, shame on you for not thinking about those with wheelchair and all that? Will that help? That is something that we need to think about. But what really matters, I think, in this whole conversation is that the building excludes persons with disabilities, which then affect the overall potential of the place to have people with multiple backgrounds and people with, whether they're with disability or not, to be able to contribute towards the intellectual culture of the university. Now, the problem is one of exclusion, and we solve the problem by looking at the issue instead of going around and questioning motives and identities and all that, which to me will not really address the situation at hand. That's point number one. Number two is that we should not think of racism as a binary between racist or not racist, because it makes the stakes frighteningly high. And it also compels us to figure who is right and who is wrong. Now, I'm talking here in terms of pedagogy, of bringing this conversation forward, yeah? But of course, we are not saying that racism can be right. No, we are not saying that racism will always be wrong, but perhaps we can think of racism more in terms of the degrees of racism along the concept of harm that I've talked about earlier. Now, even if we can't agree that something is racist or not, like in the case of the PA incident, right? Can we think together at least whether that thing being done or that thing being said is harmful? And harmful could be psychologically, emotionally, physically, and how or what we can do to reduce or eliminate that harm. So this opens the door for us to listen from those who feels that it's harmful to them, who feels that they have been harmed, and we can think of various things that have occurred in our conversation of race. For example, even name calling someone an Indian, for example, as killing, or all these various other stereotypes that are being hoisted in public sphere. Now, if we think in terms of whether it's racist or not, we can either say, yes, you are racist, or no, don't be too sensitive over it. And the conversation always goes along this plane, and it doesn't move forward, yeah? But if we think in terms of harm, then the person saying it will then possibly hold back and be persuaded to at least listen. It's not about his identity being challenged, if you call me a racist, then I feel challenged as in terms of my identity, but I do not focus on the actions that I do, and therefore it leaves very little room for self-reflection. So no one, for example, unless he's a sadist, would want to be seen as someone who harms another person. So when we talk about the principle of harm, yes, I'll finish on this point, yeah, Kenneth? Yeah, when we talk about the principle of harm, then it allows the person to adopt a posture of listening to why they feel that this person has been harmed by them, because nobody wants to be that person who harms another person. And this will also allow the victim to say why he's hurt, why it's harmful to him or her. and the perpetrators will not be triggered at being called a racist and perhaps be willing to listen and reconsider the usage of such words in future. This is just one pedagogical tool that I think we can adopt, but there are many more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't want to stop you because those were really important things you were saying from the pedagogical point of view. And there's so many questions coming in from the audience precisely on the question of pedagogy in the school system, but also public pedagogies. And that was a very helpful intervention. But we should move on to the next speaker, and that's Nazry. Shouldn't even say 5 minutes, but 5 minutes to you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Kenneth, and to AcademiaSG for holding this event. So in the next few minutes or so, I want to speak generally about knowledge production, or what philosophers call the field of study epistemology. And more specifically, I just want to focus on 2 points regarding knowledge production of race and ethnicity in Singapore. And the first is the use of terms or concepts or critical vocabulary that Yo-Yen mentioned in her introductory comment. And second is the continued danger of racial science and how we might possibly circumvent that. So let's begin with critical vocabulary. So now this stems from my observation of several red herring arguments regarding racism in Singapore, which I interpret as misdirecting us from discussing what actually needs discussing, and instead stunts the progress of improving race relations. And there are several red herring arguments that have emerged. Unfortunately, some of these have been given voice through the recent Chow Pao editorial in response to the open letter to the scholars against it. And I will name 3 of them. And these are the idea that 1, COVID-19 and social media have exacerbated racial tension. 2, the idea that a discussion on race has to be a rational discussion. And 3, that foreign ideas and concepts are detrimental to racial harmony. So given the lack of time, I will only comment on the latter 2 points, foreign ideas and rational discourse. Others have commented on the first 2 points, COVID-19 and social media, and I think we can discuss them later in the Q&A session if it's important. For now, let me start with foreign ideas. And here I want to give a quick background about my work. So I was trained as a comparative literature scholar, and that means that I study the links and parallels of non-material cultures, which refers to thoughts, values, traditions between communities, primarily through the lens of literary texts and films. And I focus on Malay cultures as my core in relation to other cultures, mostly along the Indian Ocean nexus. But put simply, I'm interested primarily in the idea of the local-global tension as it has been expressed in my materials of choice. So an important thing I've learned is that Malay cultures for a long time have a tradition of engaging and producing texts and ideas from elsewhere. But interestingly, they rework these in a way that speak to their context and of their time. And an example of this would be the reproduction of the ancient Sanskrit text of animal fables known as Pancha Tantra. And this dates back to 200 BCE or 300 CE. And this has been translated to Malay and Indonesian languages. So you will find a variety of such texts, such as Munshi Abdullah's translation of the text from Malay to Malay from Tamil, from the version of the Sanskrit, which is a very complicated process. You can also find versions that reproduces, instead of the Pancha Tantra itself, the 8th century Arabic version of the animal fables known as Kalila wa Dimna by the Persian translator Ibn al-Muqaffa. The adaptations of this latter version by different translators will reveal different concerns. So this is not the only example of translations that were like that. There were other examples of translations that were in fact cultural rewritings. In short, what I would say is that with Malay cultures of Southeast Asia, one can say that there is a tradition of reproducing foreign ideas and concepts, not as blind mimicry, but as a means of addressing, as an impetus to try to address local concerns. So recently I sat through a well-researched academic presentation suggesting that a similar phenomenon can also be seen with the Straits Chinese of Singapore. This paper was written by 2 young Singaporean scholars currently based in Edinburgh, Lee Wilson and Erin Lee, who persuasively argue that Tan Teck Soon and Lim Boon Keng of the Straits Philosophical Society in Singapore had, I quote what they said, straddled both anglicized and Sinicized spheres of knowledge, integrating both so that they can express a certain worldview about being a Straits Chinese. In short, I think that the use of concepts from elsewhere, like microaggressions and intersectionality, are not reproduced blindly, but because people here found resonances with them so as to address local concerns. They, in fact, continue a long tradition of cultural rewriting and creolization that is prevalent in this region. So the general thrust of these terms are to describe rather than to accuse, though they are describing actions that are not denying. So people get very, affected by that kind of non-denying actions that they feel that they might have done, right? And in my opinion, these terms do not cause racism, but can in fact help us better talk about racism. And this can only work if we do not pin the blame on the very terms themselves, which I reiterate is a red herring argument. The more we talk about it, the more we don't talk about the things we need to talk about. So having said that, I take the approach of the decolonization of knowledge that Imran talked about, the decolonial ideas, to articulate a kind of Singapore and Southeast Asian centric set of critical vocab. And we can already begin with some that are already out there. And I won't say too much, but things such as Lili Zubaida Rahim's use of the cultural deficit thesis, Jose Rizal's invocations of Melayu indigeneity, or the idea that the Singapore Chinese notion of original sin, of multiculturalism, of giving up so much that Ah-Eng talks about earlier, that I had actually first come across when from my co-presenter, Teng Xiaoxi, who actually we were working on a paper on Chinese privilege together. So relatedly, now I want to move on quickly to rational discourse. Earlier I said that rational discourse is a red herring argument. And if we want to have, I think, a frank discussion of racism, it is important to recognize that such a discussion cannot be curated as a rational discourse. Those who have been affected by racism will not likely speak from an objective perspective. This is because they have experienced racism subjectively and will articulate emotive responses. Insisting on an irrational discourse will only position them as being too emotional and therefore invalid. This similar charge of emotional hysteria has already been leveled at women to uphold a gender inequity. Rationalism is also a feature of racial science, which refers to ideas and theories to explain racial prejudice and stereotypes as the workings of the natural world. My reading suggests that the common assumption linking 19th century proponents of racial science, such as Robert Knox, Arthur de Gabineau, or the eugenicists, Francis Galton, to the conceptualization of race in Singapore is the propensity for evidence-based typologies. In Singapore, this is the CMIO classification backed by data of education and health performances, for instance, that constructs a naturalistic view of the world in which these four race categories are naturally different. This is racialism more than racism, but it is an equally important phenomenon in Singapore because if you think about the incident involving the Ngee Ann Polytechnic lecturer Tan Boon Lee, he insisted on that he has nothing against Dave Parkash, right? As an individual, Dave Parkash as an individual is okay, but that he should marry someone from his own race, implying that the latter's interracial coupling is unnatural. How do we circumvent the nefarious influence of racial science? I have no solid plan, but I would say that we need to approach it through a kind of disciplines and practices that do not shun the subjective emotive experiences of individuals. And we come here to the realm of art, film, literature, things that are always seen as luxury undertakings. I think about a brilliant performance I've attended featuring Maisara Al-Jaru, Christian Mark James Paul, called Brown is Haram, one of the last performances to have been staged at the substation. So that was an honest, brutal, but one of the best public commentaries on racism that I've come across. But only if we accept that it is something valid because it is emotive and subjective. An anti-racist pedagogy certainly needs to be critical and rational, but it also needs to be emotive. It needs to recognize emotive and creativity, the stuff of arts and arts making. And so I think I would just end here and maybe look forward to the Q&A.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that. And finally, we have Jerrine, 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Kenneth, and thank you so much to the organizers of today's roundtable, AcademiaSG, and my fellow panelists. So I'll try my best to keep within my time. I'm Jerrine Tan, my pronouns are she, her. I say this to acknowledge that people identify differently across the gender spectrum. And I also teach global Anglophone literature at Mount Holyoke College in the US. So my fellow panelists have touched on many pertinent and urgent topics already, so I will just put a few more things on the table to think with and think about, right? So I think Ah-Eng spoke a bit on Chinese privilege, and I'll build on it in my remarks here. So it's crucial and illuminating, I think, to look at the recent cries of racism by Chinese people, which are really cries of reverse racism, right, in relation to Chinese privilege. Racism has to do with a set of governing power structures about a system in which typically a racial majority has power and privilege over another race through political, economic, and institutional means. So racism has to do with structural injustice and inequity rather than personal beliefs. And I think other panelists have made this distinction quite clear through recent incidents as well, right? The case of the lecturer and Dave Prakash. So this is why reverse racism doesn't exist though, right? Because it's about structural injustice rather than personal beliefs. This is not to say that, even minority individuals cannot have toxic or problematic views, but the effects of those views are not systemic, right? And do not alter the status quo in ways that they do in the opposite. So often when Chinese people in Singapore cry racism against members of minority groups, they're not understanding what racism is. Right. In many of the cases that have become prominent in the media, what is charged as racism in the case of minority folks expressing their frustration or trying to hold the Chinese majority to account is an erroneous understanding of racism. Right. So we can think here of the video that Pretty Please and Subhas released in response to a brown-faced incident, to responses to Raisa Khan's tweets, for example, during last year's election season, where they both raised important questions about minorities feeling discriminated against, yet face incommensurately punitive responses and punishments, right? So conversely, few prominent Chinese figures, in contrast, have been taken to task in the same way when expressing problematic views about minorities in Singapore. I also want to think about Chinese privilege alongside its antecedent term, white privilege. So white privilege refers broadly to the implicit or systemic advantages that white people have relative to people who are not deemed white, the ways in which whiteness is often taken as the default or general view. By this definition, in Singapore, Chinese privilege works in much the same way, right, as a set of governing power structures, and insofar as Singapore is a Chinese majority society and privilege denotes the possibility to assume that yours is the general view, that society is largely tailored to cater to your community, and so on, Chinese privilege exists and is in many ways analogous to white privilege. If we look at wealth accumulation, demographics, access to power, and so on. But of course, the antecedent term here is white privilege, and Chinese people are not white. And the term white privilege was born out of and evolved within a very different historical context, right? So I raise this to acknowledge what I have been seeing as a perceived importation of Western values, right? This kind of negative response to critical race theory. So as a brief aside, it's interesting to consider this claim of critical race theory as a Western import, as Lianhe Zaobao did, as in fact there's currently a culture war and moral panic raging in the US with conservatives denouncing critical race theory. So really it shouldn't be framed as an East versus West thing, but perhaps more accurately as a conservative versus liberal issue. Right, but to go back to white and Chinese privilege, this is where the conversation gets more complex. And I want to say first that I agree that these terms are not only important, but helpful, and much more work should and must be done to develop these terms within local contexts. To go back to Imran's point, which I thought was fantastic, our modern world is undergirded by a history of colonialism shaped by white supremacy. And as a post-colonial country, Singapore reckons with this, but we don't really talk about our post-colonial status and our history in relation to this in schools very much, right? So in this framework, Chinese people in Singapore are also racialized at home and abroad in our modern world. And therefore it is possible for a Chinese person to experience racism, right? By, for example, a white expat, right? And so class here is also something that we have to think about, and we always should think intersectionally, all while on holiday to a Western country and so on. The Chinese in Singapore have experienced racist violence under the British colonial powers during the Japanese occupation, right? The Soching massacre literally was violence based on racial grounds and so on. But present conditions and power structures have changed, right? And have to be taken into account. The frequency, degree, and consequences of such interactions differ greatly from the incidents that we are concerned with today against minorities in Singapore. So crucially, without a full and robust understanding of race in relation to power structures, without a critical vocabulary to parse these complex relations, many Chinese people therefore erroneously claim victimhood across all other relations, including with minority folks at home. This is why they perceive a challenge to their privilege by a member of a minority group as racism. So I raise this not to deflect away from or excuse privilege, Chinese privilege, quite the opposite, but in fact to insist on the need for a fuller, more comprehensive and responsible approach to understanding the histories of our country and our cultures, to talk about decolonization, in order for the Chinese majority to more fully understand our position and to do better. Right. So critical race theory is something that would in fact be beneficial, very beneficial, I think, for a multicultural country like Singapore. It will give us the vocabulary and a place to start, right, and which we will form ourselves with knowledge of our own local contexts to think through our own history of racial dynamics. So touching on a few other points, I think a useful barometer in observing racist reactions to what are guised as neutral or objective reactions to, say, immigration or labor policy-related matters is by looking at the reactions of the general public across similar policies implemented across different groups. Right, so in the US, for example, it's illuminating to see how responses to, say, Russian immigrants, even after a long and bitter Cold War with the Soviet Union, which spanned decades, is not the same as those towards immigrants coming from south of the US border, those towards Asian immigrants, and indeed even Asian citizens, right? So I think that's telling. And similarly, the responses to different immigrants in Singapore show up and make visible the entrenched racism in the country. We can think about the responses and rhetoric towards immigration policies that influence the rich. We were recently seemingly very happy at being announced to be the playground for the world's rich, versus the responses and sometimes vitriolic rhetoric towards something like Sika. Right. Another example would be Rise Media, I think recently ran a story about a woman who was born in Russia, moved to Singapore, grew up in Singapore, who had to leave. And this garnered a lot of sympathy online, right? But we don't see similar responses, not in quality or in volume, to other foreigners and their stories, right? Certainly not towards laborers and helpers. So there's a difference too across reactions towards workers of the same income groups from different countries. I want to also introduce here another term to think about and think with, that of racial capitalism, which is a term coined by political theorist Cedric J. Robinson. So the purported racial harmony in Singapore is in large part very reliant on racial capitalism. The process of deriving social and economic value from the racial identity of another person. We see this in instances of tone-deaf or overtly indeed racist advertisements featuring brownface, as we saw in Singapore last year, right? The use of accents as punchlines or jokes, or indeed even the recent incident with a Malay couple's wedding picture used without their permission for Hari Raya. Right? What this exposes also is that the people, the powers that be who are making these decisions are not minority groups, right? Often, in fact, people from the majority group. We may also recall when a minister's call for Singaporeans to be decent towards foreign workers during the wave of infections was couched in their use value, right? We were told, oh, they build our nation, they keep our streets clean, etc. To say they are human should have sufficed. Right? To say they're human should have sufficed. Racial capitalism relies on and reinforces also commodification of racial identity. And this is a really superficial and reductive way of approaching racial difference and identity. This kind of commodification and reduction fosters resentment as minority folks rightly feel used, but more importantly, feel disrespected. This kind of superficial treatment of racial difference or approach to racial harmony papers over deeper issues and deflects from necessary engagement. So lastly, I just want to wrap things up and close by addressing why the Chinese majority should be as invested in this conversation, right? And should shed some of this defensiveness. Chinese people should be serious about racial justice and equality because we should all be responsible for building a more just and equitable society. This benefits all of us. So to quote Ibram X. Kendi, a scholar of critical race theory, he says it's not enough to be not racist. We must be anti-racist, right? It is a constant work in progress, but that is what it means to be a member of civil society, right? That we're all working together to better our society. And as Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison once said, the person who practices racism, who believes they are better than another because of their race, is bereft, right? Dehumanization dehumanizes the dehumanizer as well. Such toxicity infects the person who practices it. We would all be the better for doing the important, slow, hard work of dispelling such toxicity from ourselves and our society. So when our minority friends speak up to tell us about their struggles, we should listen. Thanks.
That's really splendid. And it's so many rich arguments we've heard. My mind is positively spinning, but I will attempt to thread all your different presentations to find a common thread in all these presentations. And I will invite you to kind of respond to this thread, right? And I think what holds your presentations together is a concern about public deliberation or conversations, as we call them these days, particularly about what exactly racism is. And we've heard that, you know, it mustn't be a binary notion of what racism is or isn't, but a much more nuanced understanding of racism that at least Imran suggests has to do with degrees of harm, and having that as a central concept that we all can discuss and debate. And to take seriously claims from people who say they are harmed, right? And rather than to trivialize the harm that they claim. Now, to do this satisfactorily, conversation of this kind needs to have a number of features, qualities, and this is all coming from what you've said. First of all, it needs to be shaped or informed by critical vocabularies that are that people share enough of, right? And we're hearing that this could be part of a decolonization process, the indigenization of our realities, the disavowal of power structures that have historically become our legacies and so on. So it can be that, but we mustn't also shy away from adapting ideas from other places intelligently and not blindly, right? And these could be ideas from our Southeast Asian past. It could be ideas, critical concepts from the US, as long as we apply them in an intelligent way that is sensitive to our particular history and cultural context. So white privilege, for example, can still be an important critical concept, not just something that we import blindly. And sometimes our critical vocabularies might emerge out of our effort to think comparatively across policy applications and to see why they might differ. And that might yield also critical vocabularies for us to use. That's the first point. But conversation also needs to be, I'm hearing from your presentations, also needs to be nuanced and sensitive. Ah-Eng says this right from the start, right? That it needs to be compassionate to some degree, right? That we need to someone also said not be accusatory in our efforts to discuss with one another. So compassionate, not accusatory. Now, a bit of a tension here because the accusatory mode may be an authentic mode, right? It may be exactly, as Nazry says, the kind of arising out of anger, and anger is an authentic emotion that cannot be excluded from this space that we think of as conversation, right? Invitational and so on. So what do we do about that? We want it to be civil. We want it to be compassionate and kind. We don't want to be harmful. We don't want to hurt the participants in this space. But at the same time, our civility may exclude voices that are noisy, vulgar, shrill, but authentic and important. So what should we do about that tension? Now, the third point coming out from your presentations, I think, is that these conversations need to be inclusive as well. And the problem, I guess, is, and I'm sure a lot of the audience probably feels this way, is that much of this discourse, whether it's the critical vocabularies that we're trying to create, or just the way we academics talk about this, can be thoroughly impenetrable, right? It's difficult stuff. How can ordinary people understand this? We ourselves as scholars are struggling to figure this out, right? We're using categories and terms that don't necessarily mean the same things to all of us. And they come from, they need a certain kind of decoding that some of us have and others don't. So how do we actually evolve, a language, vocabularies that are really inclusive? So not only is this language difficult and academic and jargon-filled, it's also very often in English. And quite a number of the questions that are coming through from the audience have to do with this. How do we include voices that don't, that aren't in the English language, right? We often assume that this is the language we use. So that's the third thing, the inclusivity of it. And the fourth thing is this wonderful point about not undermining the value of emotions and subjectivity. I think in Singapore, we're so technocratic and pragmatic, right? So we have a certain narrow notion of what rationality means. The rational voice is a technical voice that's, kind of cleaned of all its noisy emotions and so on. And, there's something gendered about that too, right? So how do we convince ourselves? How do we allow ourselves to include voices that we find uncomfortable, right? Again, the shrill voices, the hysterical voices, all of which could be absolutely more authentic than any of our academic critical vocabularies that we use to scaffold these discussions, right? So how do we do that? The fifth point, I think, is and part of this notion of the non-technical technically rational voice is the place of the arts. Nazry raised this, right? So the arts, the artistic modality, artistic rationality as participant in this space of discussion. And this is where I think it's interesting to bring this point that Anju raised at the beginning about stereotypes, right? That stereotypes in many ways are part and parcel of the way we understand ourselves, but even good stereotypes can be bad things, right? Because they reduce, they dehumanize, they flatten us into into a one-dimensional set of things and denies the fullness of our experience and value. But the arts can somehow other bring an added dimension to stereotypes. I don't know. Stereotypes are very often employed in the arts, right? Sometimes in an excessive way in order to show the ridiculousness of our prejudices and our discriminatory thinking, right? So the arts can actually shame us through the use of stereotypy and all these kinds of things. So is that what you mean, Nazry, that we can actually complexify this space with artistic treatments? And what do we do about satire and parody and all these kinds of things that only some people seem to get? But when you do get it, it kind of dismantles the power structures that we've relied on, right, to make sense of our world. The fifth point is good faith, that somehow or other we speak as if we can expect the participants to treat this space and one another in good faith, but that's a massive assumption, right? What if the privileged don't accept the description of them being privileged, right? How can we even expect them to be sensitive and generous to others? How can we expect them to feel that they have the upper hand and they're not as vulnerable, maybe more vulnerable than the others who we're depicting as the harmed, right? How do we actually convince the privileged to accept that they are privileged, to accept that their actions might be toxic, to accept that they might be racist? If they don't even believe that they are racist, how could we even expect them to be anti-racist, right? And finally, this is the toughest one, I think. We can say all we want about how to progress our vocabulary and our practice of figuring out what racism is and how to overcome it. But the underlying forces have very much to do with racial capitalism, commodification, and I guess what we could all call neoliberal multiracialism, right? CMIO is kind of that, isn't it? It's a neoliberal project that has economic value, which kind of in its commodification pretends that inequalities don't exist, pretends that privilege doesn't exist, but it's the underlying thing that's not just a nice idea that we've held on to for a long time, but it's driven by economic forces. And what is Singapore but a creation of economic forces, right? So let me invite anyone to respond to that before we maybe take specific questions. There are many things in there, I acknowledge, but I was trying to pull all your presentations together. I invite anyone to respond to any of that. Anju smiling, meaning you would love to say something. Go ahead, please.
I'll remember not to smile next time.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Kenneth. I think you summarized and distilled the conversation so beautifully. Thank you so much. I feel like we lost Ah-Eng. Is she here? I can't see her.
Yeah, neither can I.
Yeah, we're working on the back end to sort that out. Please carry on.
Thanks, Yuyan. I mean, I think I'm going to address one of the questions that you raised about how to make this conversation more inclusive and bring in more people besides the usual suspects or the choir to some extent. And I do think that what you mentioned and what several of the panelists have said about the role of the arts in particular is incredibly powerful. There are the arts and then there are also the school systems. I think both of those are territories where it's possible, hi Ah-Eng, where it's possible to capture people in moments of vulnerability and openness to new ideas and new ways of understanding the world, where they're able to set aside some preconceived notions, or maybe have yet to form those notions even, and are willing to consider that there might be other realities other than their own. And I think that is something that that needs to be capitalized on. There's a lot that can be done to show people other lived experiences other than their own, because oftentimes we don't even realize what it means to be from a different race or from a different ethnic group. We just haven't, unfortunately, our social networks are such that oftentimes we don't have that many friends or people that we interact with who come from a different racial or ethnic group. And so we don't have those opportunities to ask them or learn from them about what it means to be from that particular group, what their reality is. And so I think there have to be these spaces in the arts and education, and then more such spaces created where people can learn about what it means to be Indian or Malay or Chinese or any other category that we don't even have names for, and begin to see that in fact that person's experience of living in this country could be diametrically opposed to one's own. And hopefully that willingness to realize that will also allow people to be a little bit more vulnerable and less defensive as they realize that there can be these systemic inequalities prevalent in society.
So a lot hinges on the experiences that we create in the school system at that early stage of their lives. And I guess partly it's a question also of whether that school environment has changed over all these years. Is it perhaps true that it's much more monocultural in each of these classes these days compared to the past, perhaps, right? Or is there something about the curriculum and the pedagogy that has kind of de-privileged, more I don't know, activity-based, more sort of experiential aspects of cross-cultural learning and so on. I mean, the arts is an interesting space to connect with the experience of the schools. But here we hit a problem, right? Because whenever it's to do with race or religion or whatever it is, the artwork gets slapped with some ridiculous, what do you call it, classification, right? That limits the access of students who perhaps would most benefit from the arts at that stage of their life. So there's a policy problem at that stage, being overly censorious about talking about race. And that's very fundamental, isn't it? I don't know, Nazry, I mean, you're the arts guy, the arts education guy, right? So I mean, is that one of the main problems?
So I think there's a way to be speaking about structures and cage structures that do not have to actually mention race or actually be explicit about it for earlier this one. So for instance, when you take, form itself, the art is always built on forms and going against certain forms, which is a kind of abstract way of trying to look at structures and how to move beyond structures. Take a poem that with a strict rhyme scheme that you can then introduce a poem with the kind of free form, right? Free flowing verse, for instance. And then you can look and compare between the two. And in some ways, then think about how, how conventions can be broken. Things don't need to be done the way they always do. So I think in the early stages, maybe in early, childhood education, I think a kind of interest in how to look at conventions and how to break conventions, and for the progress of trying to reach a better kind of form is actually a way to go. So I think there is a way of doing that. And then later on, here I just want to quickly talk about a project that I was involved in, and Imran was there as well. I think it's a project that was funded by the National Integration Council, of which we tried to use artistic materials, basically literary texts and plays, to try to get children from, tertiary students from different schools to come together to try to talk about race. I think Imran was one of the moderators for one of the sessions on race. And I think based on the feedback from the students, we had students from an international school, SUTD students where I'm at, and also students from a polytechnic come together. There were a lot of hiccups. There were a lot of this one, but one of the things that we noticed is that, especially with the international students, they learn a little bit more about how race relations operate in Singapore. At the start, they were thinking that, everything is fine and dandy, but as you go through things, then they get to see, certain things that are not there. So I think this was kind of a safe space that I think that can be developed out of that. And I think another safe space are basically artistic materials in any form, a show and stuff like that, because they give us accord us a certain distance. They are a kind of they talk about reality without talking about reality, and they are impetus for us to think through what we cannot do when we engage on a one-to-one discussion because of the reality coming into the picture, just who you are and who I am and your baggage and my baggage, but using an art piece as a kind of impetus for us to talk through things. I think that's certainly a way to go. Yep.
Nazry, can I ask you and Imran maybe to comment also on I mean, what you're saying sounds great, right? But I imagine, if you ask a lot of teachers to do this, they would be terrified, right? They would be utterly, I mean, some of course will love it, right? And to be so prepared to do this. But I think the majority of teachers who would love to be able to get to generate this conversation in their classrooms and build materials out of arts and other kinds of pedagogies and all of that would be, would feel ill-prepared. Yeah. And partly also, I guess, is the sense in which you have the other side of the problem, right? Which is a lot of young people actually know a lot more about race and religion than many of the teachers, kind of in a sense, the woke generation, right? So if a teacher walks in and kind of doesn't really know, enough of that woke stuff, they might expose a lot of their vulnerability in the class. So you get a problem from both ends. So how do they deal with this? Must they rely on people like you, you and Imran all the time? And are there enough people like you to enrich the school
thanks
system?
for that question. I'll give a quick answer because I think others can speak as well. So for me, I actually don't like the use of the term woke. I think that's a little bit, derogatory to me. But in any case, I think the idea that teachers can engage in such things, but I think we need to actually train the teachers in some ways. And I think this is something that is lacking in our education system, in our teacher training system, that we don't have enough of such teachers to maybe handle such issues. So I just will say that and then maybe pass the floor to others.
Maybe I can just jump in here because I have a bit of experience in schools also. I think teachers are also creatures of their time. I mean, they grew up in a certain environment, in a certain pedagogical style. And I must say that when I was younger, the kind of classroom that I was subjected to was quite authoritarian, where, it's the banking pedagogy that Paulo Freire talked about, where you're supposed to be an empty vessel and the teacher just pour in whatever information and you're supposed to shut up and just take in everything, right? I think that kind of pedagogy is what many of us were subjected to, and that's what we understand by learning itself. But I think that times have changed, and you are right. The opening up of the spaces, especially with social media and all that, allows for various sources of information and platforms for information. And sometimes students know a lot more than the teachers. So the idea of what it means to be a teacher itself has to change. As a teacher is also at the same time also a learner. So it's a kind of a co-creation of the space where both teacher learn and teach at the same time with the students. So without that kind of reframing of the idea of education itself, I think it's very difficult to move forward. That's why teachers feel vulnerable, because they're not competent. They don't feel competent to speak about the subject of race or racism. And therefore the easier way out is to just silence it and not talk about it. This has to be addressed at the policy level, really, in my opinion, as in possibly the Ministry of Education has to step in and really do a nationwide program to actually train the teachers on how to engage in conversations such as these. Some schools that are a bit more independent have been doing it. because they can have their own their autonomy to decide on the programs that they can bring in. And this is where I see a lot more of the schools like, for example, Raffles Institution or RGS. They are able to do this kind of thing because a bit more autonomy. But I think it has to be at the level of all schools across Singapore, and that has to come from policy level, from the Ministry of Education. And I'm quite glad that the former Minister of Education, Ah-Eng, has actually hinted towards that previously. I think it was last year. Yeah, but I think we need to follow through on that.
Yeah, I really want to ask Jerrine also to say something about the comparative experience of race education in classrooms in the US compared to Singapore. But before I do that, you mentioned, Imran, that some schools can afford to do this race programs in their courses and all of that. So one question is, do you know if do you know what the outcomes of those courses have been? And I imagine that if just the elite schools can do this, there might be some unintended consequences that may not be so desirable as well.
I really do not know. I have to think through this. Yeah, but really, I think at the same time also some of these elite schools, well, all schools are good schools, right?
Of course, yeah.
Some of these elite schools, the proportion of diversity is also quite low. So engaging in that conversation in these schools itself is good, I think. At least it exposes them to multiple perspectives beyond their own bubbles.
Okay, great. I want to ask Jerrine to comment on the comment, and then after that, I want to ask Ah-Eng to say something, because you've been observing how this all has evolved over these many decades, right? And you've curated a lot of edited volumes and all that, in which studies have been done about the climate in the school, even the playground, and all these kinds of things. Do you see shifts over this time? But before that, Jerrine, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have several thoughts, and I think this ties back to also what you were talking about, how to get the majority to kind of be willing to engage, to not feel defensive, and so on. And I think several things are at play here as well, right? But drawing from what we've just talked about, really an issue with education, both at the policy level, as Imran was talking about, but at various other levels, right? Even in the interpersonal relationships within the classroom, between students and with teachers. And so to go back to the pedagogical point, Imran raised earlier as well, and which you raised earlier, I think of good faith, I think is really, really important, right? To approach something in good faith, and to acknowledge that we will all probably make mistakes and that they are hopefully not intentional, right? So in my classroom, I have this conversation very early on in the semester. I tell students that, the classroom is a sacred space, right? That is absolutely magical, that we can have these difficult conversations. And in fact, knowledge is produced not in agreement, but in disagreement, right? Good disagreement, helpful disagreement. And that can only be done in good faith. So there's also the concept, for example, of calling in rather than calling out, right? As the woke, if we use that derogatorily, left or the woke public or woke whatever will do, right? To call out merely to shame, I think is the implication, but rather to call in as well, right? To have a conversation, to work through the difficult feelings. But it is important to note that that is easier to do in a classroom space because that is controlled, right? You have students, okay, I'll sign up for this class, I'm interested in this, right? There's already a selection bias, as there's a selection bias on this panel and the people who have tuned in today. So again, it's a broader problem of education, public education, right? Education at the very fundamental levels. In the US, it's easier to talk about this in some ways, right? More difficult in others because it's very polarized as well. But because there's a long history of this engagement already, right? Difficult, often fraught, sometimes wrong engagement, but engagement. There is, for example, Black History Month, right? We just had in May AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, right? Where you focus, you dedicate time to think about these things, you highlight, you bring in people from those groups to talk about these issues, right? And that has been lacking in Singapore because we kind of plaster on Racial Harmony Day, we all problematically wear each other's clothes, yeah. And there's no problem. So it begins with acknowledging that there is a problem, right? But problem as in something that is to be worked on, rather than simply called out and just faulted or shamed or so on, right? So engagement, I think, is key here. And therefore terms like good faith, calling in are really helpful. But also on the topic of education, I think we also have to debunk the myth of meritocracy. Right? And that goes to what Anju was talking about as well with stereotypes, even good stereotypes. So the first one that comes to mind is the model minority myth in the US, right? So to draw from Anju, something that you, to use an example you use, here you have, for example, oh, Asians are good at math, right? So they get high-paying jobs as engineers, blah, 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 professionals, they do well for themselves. And to draw on your example, Anju, say Indians like to argue, therefore become good lawyers and so on. But these stereotypes, these model minority myths, because they are myths, right, enable often the hegemonic culture and so on to pit groups against each other, right, in order to preserve the structure of power, right, that benefits those at the top, those who indeed created that structure. So the myth of meritocracy has to be debunked. And that also will then bring us to think intersectionally, right, as we must, about race, broadly about privilege, about class, about gender, indeed, and so on and so forth. And this too, stop me if I'm kind of running over my time, takes us back to broader conversations beyond Singapore, right? Singapore doesn't exist, we are an island, but we exist within global forces, broader geopolitics, and so on. And so we're also existing in this moment where the whole world, I think, is really reckoning with a lot of these issues, right? And to go back to racial capitalism, this enables us, right? This is also happening at a time when Singapore is becoming very prominent on the world stage, right? Through specifically things like, Hollywood films like Crazy Rich Asians, right? Where our, prominence is linked to our economic success, right? And in that success are portrayed only certain groups of people, right? While other groups are either left out or portrayed in different ways, right? Less positive ways. Or in global events like, say, Miss Universe more recently, where in the US, right, the Asian American community was very excited to see Miss Singapore with Stop Asian Hate, which is a trending kind of slogan here, right? Because, Asian presenting people have been targeted, especially during the pandemic and so on. But that allows for, in the worst sense, right, people in Singapore to traffic in this kind of language, right? To pat ourselves on the back. Yes, Singapore has solved racism, when in fact our issues are different, right? Singapore is a Chinese majority. We have other minority groups that we need to think about. So not to say that, Singapore saying Stop Asian Hate is bad, it's good, it's necessary, but we have different sets of issues, and supporting problems elsewhere doesn't automatically solve ours at home, right? In fact, it begs a more concerted effort to really face our own issues head on.
Thank you, that's splendid. Can I turn to you, Ah-Eng, and I'll ask you a very naively framed question, which is, are things better today than they were before, or are they just a lot worse than they were before?
I think that's very hard to answer in a general way. Maybe I could sort of zero in on particular areas of social life, and also maybe through my own limited experience, of course, as an anthropologist involved in research and publication. Well, I would say, first of all, I've lived through a race riot when I was young. This was in Kuala Lumpur. And that's perhaps that specifically, and just growing up in a place like Malaysia the first 25 years, and then being here much of the time, except for some stints abroad, I would say that the picture is never clear. Like I say, there will always be minefields, but there are always things to celebrate and to live for and to love. And I think we'll always be moving between these two areas. And whenever the problems are underlying, some of them seem to be better. Just when you think it's better, you get something that pops up, okay? So like, as everybody says, this is a work in progress. How are we going to respond to specific issues, specific incidences? It's very important. But from the point of view, from my own narrow experiences, trying to do research and publication, it's also, variable. But on the whole, it's better. When I first wanted to do research on how resettlement, for example, brought people together and having to live together in a mixed housing estate, no doubt, in a public housing estate, no doubt the Chinese still majority, but for the first time, many people had to live together in close quarters next to each other in a more multicultural setting, if you like. There were so many things to look at, but I wasn't allowed to do it. Okay, so I had to find independent source funding to do that. And then when I wanted to publish my doctorate thesis, it's supposed to be very good. No local publisher would want to publish it. So I wanted to encourage local publishing, but nobody, the local publishers didn't want to do it because it's considered not the right time, too sensitive, etc., etc. So I had to go to Oxford University Press. And so the story goes on and on. Specifically, when it came to that particular book on Beyond Rituals and Riots, that included quite a few contributions from academics in education. First of all, they had a lot of problem after it was found that they were going to publish in this book. Okay. In fact, a couple of them were so scared they wanted to withdraw from the book launch and the conference that followed. I was asked to change the title because rituals and riots, well, I was asked to take out the riots bit and change to something else. It's not criticism of the individuals who asked me to do it, but it just goes to show how it was perceived even by people in safe places to be dangerous or difficult to manage. Okay, of course I sat on the draft and I wouldn't let go. So and they were open-minded. They allowed me to let that through. So you can see bits of it coming slowly. So I would say by now, to be able to have a webinar like this, having a range of academics to talk about this is really an improvement. And we should really ride on this opportunity. I have one point to make about my own teaching. I don't teach at the secondary school or primary school level. I teach at the university level. And even there, there's quite a lot to be learned on how to create a safe space and a healthy, creative space for students. These are university students who will go out, okay, and occupy certain positions of power probably, okay? How to get them to realize the kind of world that we live in, very multicultural, very high diversity, and how you're going to navigate this world when you go out from university. And I found that even with students, I have to think through very carefully how to conceptualize the module so that you don't immediately plunge, for example, into debates about privilege or racism and all that. I found that it was better to develop slowly, okay, because many of them have not encountered these issues or encountered them rather superficially, and quite a number of them are actually foreign students. carrying with them their own orientations and preferences. So to develop a way of getting students to be open-minded, to learn, and and to develop something and move forward into a highly diverse world takes very careful consideration. So I usually start with asking them to do something very simple. One project is just about their own histories, and that's presented, and people realize that, hey, you know, this is how somebody who lived in Pulau Tekong, or at least the grandfather who lived in Pulau Tekong, had what the grandfather had to say about living in Pulau Tekong, and when there was fear of riots, how would they resolve those issues? So I always made them do a project, number one, on history that must include their own cultural, ethnic, but also inter-ethnic dimension. Yeah, and that is very powerful, a way to get students to learn about their histories and other people's histories. And then we move on to something else. One last point, very concrete. When I get students to, I always advise them that when they write, please do not say cultures. Very specific. This is also part of a vocabulary and ways of thinking and ways of expressing. Please do not talk about cultures. Refer to subcultures. Okay, the subcultures that of, say, gambling that seems to be dominant among Chinese. Okay, don't say that the gambling is in the DNA of the Chinese. Don't say things like that anymore. Okay, you got to unlearn those. Don't say the Chinese, say some Chinese, okay? Yeah. It seems very simple, but they don't do it. They don't say the Chinese, the Malays. Yeah. You know, avoid generalizations, overgeneralizations. Those things, I think we reach a point when you're writing, you really have to almost start from scratch, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's very, very practical advice. And I think a very good place to bring this to a conclusion. Sadly, there's never enough time to get as much as we possibly could from all of you, wonderful speakers on this panel. And you know, it's so difficult to get to all the questions as well. I hope, though, that looking at the questions that have come in, the 70 odd questions that came in even before this session, that we were able to kind of address some of them in a grouped way rather than individual way. And I would urge the organizers to maybe organize some follow-up activities to address some of these really excellent questions and draw on the great expertise and experience that we've got here. So thank you everyone for a wonderful conversation, which I've really learned a lot from. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let me just close. In the lead up to tonight, as well as during the session, we received such a wide range of questions. It just did not stop. And our speakers really faced a very tough challenge of trying to address this very disparate collection, you know, not just a large volume, but also really such a wide range that I think it will take probably more sessions to deal with properly. I want to thank the speakers for speaking so seriously and insightfully to such a complex range. I think it wasn't really possible to get to everybody's questions, but that nonetheless, we've accumulated a number of concepts to think with. And I want to point out and appreciate that you know, through conversation, you also modeled the possibility for speaking with rather than past one another, and the value of being open to challenge and to sit with friction, you know, rather than to run from it, and to discuss issues that are personal and emotive and where we have varying and unequal material and symbolic interests. I think that too is a crucial lesson to draw from tonight. So on behalf of AcademiaSG, our huge thanks to Anju, Ah-Eng, Imran, Nazry, Jerrine, for being so generous in sharing your reflections and insights. And thank you, Kenneth, for so skillfully pulling together the threads and facilitating the conversation. Finally, we also, a bit breathless trying to get this out very fast. We also want to thank all of you in the audience for showing up, asking the questions you've asked, being part of this discursive community. This building of community is also a major aspiration for AcademiaSG, and we are appreciative whenever we see it taking shape. I hope you will go away tonight feeling energized by the conversation and ready to further the labor of regarding, reducing, disrupting racism. And I hope to see you again as well in future engagements. The video of this event is on YouTube if you would like to share it with others. I also invite you to look at the bios of each of our speakers tonight more closely and to read their work. I think there's a lot more that they have to share that, you know, it's not possible to fit into a 2-hour session. We will continue to get other ideas out there in the form of commentaries and essays. And given the overwhelming response to this event, we will also think about how to plan further sessions and webinars. To stay in touch with our continuing work, you can follow us, AcademiaSG, on Facebook, and you may sign up for our newsletter. We also have a YouTube channel that you can look at. So thank you again, everyone. Until next time, I hope you stay well and be healthy. Thank you.
Thank you very much.